Hyde. I'm Brian Hyde, and a lot has happened in a very short amount of time in our country, in our state, maybe even in our communities, and it's leaving a lot of people confused, angry, and of course wondering what's the best direction to go. I have a few thoughts for you on this, particularly how, as we go forward, there's going to be a great need for good people to influence good policy. That doesn't always mean just get on a political team and cheer the loudest, but I'll tell you what it does mean in just a moment.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm glad you could join us. I'm glad you found us. And in fact, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you have recently discovered this twice a week video, courtesy of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, tell a friend, tell someone who is either, leaning in the direction of freedom or maybe sitting on the fence thinking, which way do I go? We need all the help that we can get. And I'll give you a couple of good examples of this. Of course, just in the last 24 hours, Donald Trump was convicted of, I think, 34 different charges, felony convictions. And there's, I guess his sentencing date is July 11th, just a few days before he is supposedly going to accept the nomination as a Republican nominee for president. And look, there's no way to put it other than the justice system, I'll put that in air quotes, has definitely been weaponized against a certain part of the body politic, about half of America from the looks of things. And that has a lot of people very on edge, very angry. And I think rightly so. It's clear that what we were told was the finest justice system in the world, full of fairness and, the ability to get a fair shake and, the laws are to protect you. It doesn't feel that way anymore. In fact, if anything, it feels like we are seeing laws piled upon laws for the purpose of punishing whatever groups are not currently in favor with those in power and rewarding those who are. And in fact, I've got a quote I want to share with you. I think that this kind of illustrates a little bit of the challenge that we face. Here's a quote from Nicolas Gomez Davila. Dying societies accumulate laws like dying men accumulate remedies. Now, I don't mean to be fatalistic, but we are witnessing the death of a society. We're witnessing the death of a political system. And it's not because, somebody just snuck up and stabbed it in the back in the middle of the night. This is the culmination of decades and even generations of choices that have led us farther and farther away from the founding principles upon which this nation was founded. In fact, if you ask people, what were the founding ideals? What were the principles upon which our system of government was based? A lot of people are just going to give you kind of this brook trout impression. they don't know how to answer it. And it's because it's been trained out of us over generations, primarily in public schools, which teach what is ever most efficacious to whoever's in power at the time, right? Because they're the ones who write the checks for those textbooks. But if you are serious about making a difference and you want to wield your influence in ways that will make a difference now as well as in the future, you've got to be smart in how you approach this. And this means you cannot be led simply by enemy-driven thinking, which unfortunately dominates politics to an extent that I think most of us would never have believed. So let me share a quick story with you. Recently, I flew to Germany to visit some family there. And I had the privilege of sitting on this flight, and it was a 9.5-hour flight, next to a couple from Coeur d'Alene, which I thought of all the people to find myself sitting next to. And as I'm sitting there, and I'm not trying to be nosy, but I could see that the woman I was sitting next to was like scrolling through Twitter, and I could see she was looking at a couple of memes, which I would say were pretty obviously anti-Trump, but I didn't take that as, this is my cue to set her straight on how Trump is the one and only guy who can save us. Instead, I just started a conversation as far as, so you guys are from Coeur d'Alene. Was there a lot of drama there during the primary here a few weeks ago? And both she and her husband were like, oh my gosh, they just said, we've been longtime residents there. We just can't believe what's happening. And I don't know, but I get the impression that probably we would be on opposite sides of many of those political questions. But I want you to understand when I say this, and yes, I'm saying this kind of tongue in cheek since this has been used against Donald Trump. They struck me as very fine people. as in I think genuinely concerned for their community, genuinely concerned for their own well-being as well as their kids are grown up and gone, but they did not strike me as a bunch of purple-haired activists out there ready to raise hell and tear down everything that came before them. And I say this because that was a really pleasant flight. I'm not going to say it was a comfortable one. Sitting in a seat for 9.5 hours is never going to be a lot of fun. But we made the best of the situation, and I felt a kinship with them in that I think that we want a lot of the same things. And it would have been very easy, to try to play up. Well, I'm a conservative, or I believe in this, but instead I tried to find out, what they cared about, where they were coming from. And again, they were not activists in the sense that they were loudly, wearing on their sleeves, their pronouns or whatever. But I'm pretty sure that we were probably on opposite polar sides of the political debate. Nonetheless, we managed to get along quite well in very tight confines for an extended period of time. And I hope that they left with a similar positive impression of me. Now, my goal wasn't just to sit there and impress them. My goal was to plant seeds and help people remember, myself most of all, that the people who you're being told are your enemies, the people you're being told you either have to denounce them or you're not a good person. If someone else is insisting that you chant in unison with whatever the slogan is that they're proffering, take a giant step backwards. In fact, if they start chanting in unison, if a crowd starts chanting in unison, that's a good time to run, because nothing good is going to happen from that point. But because we are seeing such a decided seesaw back and forth over control of power, and yes, Republicans can abuse power just as well as Democrats can, we have to first understand, if we want to be really decent people who have, the right kind of influence on moving that political needle where it needs to be, which I hope is in the direction of greater personal freedom, less taxes, or at least less costs to us in terms of our time, our money, and our efforts to satisfy whatever government says is our obligation to it, but also to make sure that we're shouldering the appropriate amount of responsibility. In other words, we have to be good people. We have to be those very fine people that others can look to as a source of, well, you know what? We may see differently on certain issues, but that doesn't mean that we have to be enemies over this. And this goes for left or right. When someone starts to insist that we need to capture the power of government because we got to force them to do what we want them to do, you're coming at this from a position of, improper government. And there are people who are working very hard right now to keep government limited. You'll know them. They're the ones that the legacy press refers to as the extremists and, these dangerous far right kind of people. What they're insisting on, though, is that government observe its limits. And simply saying no, something like, you know what, I don't think we should have cartoon books as a sexual how-to aimed at children and trying to introduce them to things that are well beyond their maturity. Someone saying we should probably make that not accessible to kids in the public library. Well, you're denounced as a book burner. You're just trying to control librarians. There's a war against literacy. And that's the deception on the part of those who are seeking power and seeking control, trying to force others to do their bidding. Don't be that person. Now, I want to share with you a couple of gems of wisdom, courtesy of one of my favorite mentors, and that's a gentleman by the name of Paul Rosenberg. And if you want to be the kind of person who can be taken seriously, and by the way, being taken seriously doesn't mean that everybody you talk to suddenly has this amazing conversion and they become, whatever politically you identify as. More often it takes the form of planting a seed that can take hold and that they can examine and nurture at their own pace. I know we want instant satisfaction, right? We want to tell them about some very pithy slogan and have the light come on and they're like, oh, well, finally, I get it. That's not how it works. People have to come to truth on their own terms. And if you want to be the kind of person who is a truth seed planter, someone who actually opens minds that have been closed like steel traps, maybe for many years, first thing you got to do is be a decent person yourself. That means you're going to have to speak the truth with love. If they respond with anger or defensively, you don't take it personal and you don't respond in kind and become antagonistic. You plant the seed, walk away if necessary, but you've got to be the kind of person that people can look to and understand that this is an adult. This is someone I can take seriously. Most people who are deeply, like neck deep in the political game, They're not people who can be taken seriously. And here's how Paul Rosenberg explains the difference. He says there are all sorts of ways to make a show of being a legitimate adult. You can be a frightening brute. You can display your intellectual prowess. You can hold up your wealth, your status, or beauty. Or you can threaten others with power that stands ready to avenge you. But he says none of those things make you a real man or a real woman. In fact, generally, they show the opposite. So if you want to become a real, credible person, if you want to be the kind of person that people can take legitimately, he says, you got to be willing to suffer for your beliefs. And he says, to be specific, we're not talking about just any kind of suffering. After all, everyone suffers. What he's talking about is to suffer because of your personal moral devotion to something. That kind of suffering shows there's solid ground in your soul. Now, it could be something very simple. It could be simply, when everybody's going around introducing themselves by pronouns, you just simply say, I don't participate in that, or no thanks, I don't have any pronouns that I wish to share. Okay, that's not being confrontational. You can stand your ground, but you don't have to be, you don't have to puff up like a gorilla to try to dominate them. But it's still hard because you will likely face some kind of, well, what's wrong with you? How come you're not on board? Are you a hater? Are you a bigot or something like that? It's just the way that some people seem to be programmed. Now, let's talk a little bit more about suffering. This is what Paul Rosenberg means. He says, so either you have taken a principled risk, suffered for it, and held your position, or the rest of us just can't be sure of you. In other words, either you've suffered for something that you thought was right, or you haven't. And he makes a very clear distinction here. That doesn't mean you always have to be right, but it does mean that you have to be the kind of person who is at least in touch enough with your conscience that you are willing to stand on what you believe is right to the best of your knowledge. And if it turns out that you're wrong, well, you may have to apologize or say, okay, I didn't get that right. But the point is, it's not about being right. It's about being upright. In other words, true to your conscience based on what you understood. And that also means being open to new truth as you happen to encounter it. So, one final thought, and this is the point that he really tries to drive home. Until you have suffered for righteousness, there's no incontestable reason for the rest of us to take you as a serious adult. And it's important, too, you understand, you have to suffer as an individual. You have to face personal consequences, not collective consequences. And until you do, the rest of us have no way of being sure if you're the real deal or not. Going along with a group, even if it's a minority group, is not the same thing as making a costly individual choice. And until that happens, the rest of us lack a reason to trust you as an individual. Now, let me tell you the good news. No, it's not fun. When somebody is calling you names, when someone is calling you out, when the cancel culture mob is in full cry and inviting you or demanding you attend your struggle session to confess your sins, you don't have to attend. But it sucks the first time people take a very public swipe at you. It is not fun, but you will learn what you are made of. You'll also learn what you believe in, because that first blow, usually for most people, is kind of a wake-up call where they're like, whoa, do I really believe this or not? Because, well, it's not fun. But if you show yourself that you are willing to suffer for what you believe is right and what is true, not only will you gain the confidence that comes from legitimately having gone through that rite of passage, and if you can't think of one of those things ever happening in your life, maybe it's time to consider how can I make that happen? But it also does something for the people around you, and that is, look, whether they agree with you or not, even your most vocal critics will have to grudgingly admit you have skin in the game. You're willing to suffer for your beliefs. There's substance to you. There's substance to your soul. So I hope that's helpful. I know I don't know anybody who's a masochist who really likes that suffering. Oh boy, goody, everybody's going to hate me and call me names. But if you want to make a difference, we live in such a time where you cannot do so without being willing to suffer for the sake of righteousness. The good news is when you do, it turns the light on, not only within yourself, but also it turns the light on for other people who are looking for an example of which way to go, of where truth may lie. I hope this is helpful. Thanks again for joining us. This is Nowhere to Hide.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our